The humid Alabama air of 1861 hung thick and heavy over the sprawling cotton fields of Blackwood Manor, a scent of damp earth and blossoming magnolias that did little to mask the underlying stench of human suffering. It was a scent Amelia, the newest mistress of the manor, was slowly, sickeningly beginning to recognize. At 19, she was the third wife of Silas Blackwood, a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear across the county. His fortune, built on the backs of the 150 souls who worked his land, was as vast as the fields of white gold that stretched to the horizon. His cruelty, as Amelia was beginning to learn, was just as boundless. Her arrival at Blackwood Manor had been a blur of forced smiles and stifling social niceties. A whirlwind courtship orchestrated by her debt-ridden father had culminated in a hasty wedding. Now standing on the grand veranda, looking out at the endless rows of cotton, a sense of profound unease settled in her stomach, as heavy as the unspiced hominy she'd been served for breakfast. Silas was a man of imposing stature, with a shock of prematurely gray hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He carried himself with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. He had been charming during their courtship, quoting poetry and speaking of a future filled with laughter and children. But since their wedding night, a chilling transformation had taken place. The poetry had ceased, replaced by curt commands and a possessive grip on her arm that left bruises in the shape of his fingers. Her predecessor, the second Mrs. Blackwood, was a topic no one dared to broach. The enslaved people, when she tried to engage them in conversation, would cast their eyes down, their faces a mask of impenetrable silence. The house servants, particularly the head housekeeper, a stern older woman named Hattie, would simply change the subject. Her lips pursed in a thin line of disapproval. All Amelia knew was that she had gone away, a vague and unsettling explanation that hung in the air like a phantom. Amelia's days were a monotonous cycle of managing the household, a task she was ill-prepared for. She was expected to oversee the cooking, the cleaning, the mending, all performed by a small army of enslaved women whose names she was struggling to remember. They moved through the grand house like ghosts, their expressions carefully blank, their movements economical and silent. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive heat and her husband's brooding presence, Amelia wandered into the library. It was a room Silas rarely used, a collection of leather-bound books that served more as a testament to his wealth than his intellect. Running a hand along a dusty shelf, her fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound diary tucked away behind a row of Shakespearean plays. Curiosity piqued, she pulled it out. The diary belonged to Eleanor, the first Mrs. Blackwood. Her handwriting was a delicate, looping script, a stark contrast to the grim entries that filled the pages. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she read of Eleanor's initial optimism, her hopes for a happy marriage, and then the slow, insidious descent into despair. Eleanor wrote of Silas's coldness, his obsessive desire for a male heir, and his growing frustration with her inability to provide one. A particular passage sent a shiver down Amelia's spine. Eleanor wrote of a special cabin hidden deep in the woods at the edge of the property, a place Silas referred to as his nursery. She had been forbidden from going there, and the enslaved people spoke of it only in hushed, terrified whispers. It was, they said, a place where women went and never returned. The diary ended abruptly, the last few pages filled with frantic, almost illegible scribbles. "He knows," she had written. "He knows I cannot give him what he wants. He speaks of a new venture, a way to improve his stock. I fear what he means. I fear for my life." Amelia slammed the diary shut, her hands trembling. The veiled whispers, the averted gazes, the chilling emptiness of the grand house. It all began to coalesce into a horrifying picture. She was not just a wife. She was a vessel, a means to an end. And if she failed to fulfill her purpose, she too would be sent away. That evening at dinner, she watched Silas across the long, polished mahogany table. He ate with a voracious appetite, his gaze fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. He spoke of the impending war, of the glorious future of the Confederacy, of the importance of a strong lineage to carry on the Blackwood name. His words were laced with a chilling subtext, a threat that hung unspoken in the air between them. Later that night, as Silas slept, his heavy breathing filling the cavernous bedroom. Amelia crept out of the house. The moon cast long, eerie shadows across the manicured lawns as she made her way towards the woods. She had to know. She had to see this nursery for herself. The fate of the women who had come before her, and her own, depended on it. The air grew cooler as she entered the woods, the scent of pine and damp earth replacing the cloying sweetness of the magnolias. The only sound was the crunch of her own footsteps on the fallen leaves and the frantic beating of her own heart. She was walking into the heart of the darkness that was Blackwood Manor, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that there might be no turning back. Chapter 2. The Whispers of the Quarters. The slave quarters of Blackwood Manor were a world away from the opulent splendor of the great house. A collection of small, crudely built cabins, they stood in a neat row at the edge of the cotton fields, a constant, silent testament to the source of Silas Blackwood's wealth. It was a place Amelia had been explicitly forbidden to go. "It is no place for a lady," Silas had said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Their ways are not our ways." But Eleanor's diary, and the gnawing fear that had taken root in her heart, had emboldened her. She knew that if she was to uncover the truth of Blackwood Manor, she would have to venture into the world her husband had so carefully hidden from her. She chose her moment carefully, a sweltering afternoon when Silas had ridden out to a neighboring plantation to discuss matters of secession and war. With a basket of freshly baked bread and a jar of cool water as a pretense, she made her way towards the quarters. The air in the quarters was different, thick with the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and something else. Something she couldn't quite name, a mixture of sorrow and resilience. The enslaved people, returning from the fields for their midday meal, watched her approach with a mixture of suspicion and surprise. A white woman, the mistress of the house, had never before set foot in their domain. An old woman, with skin the color of rich earth and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 sorrows, was sitting on the steps of her cabin, mending a torn shirt. Her name was Mama Rose, and she was the unofficial matriarch of the quarters, a woman who had seen more than her fair share of suffering. Amelia approached her hesitantly, her carefully rehearsed speech dying on her lips. She offered the bread and water, a clumsy gesture of peace. Mama Rose accepted them with a quiet nod, her gaze never leaving Amelia's face. "What you want, child?" she asked, her voice a low, raspy whisper. Amelia's carefully constructed facade crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke of her fears, of the diary, of the whispers of a nursery in the woods. She spoke of the 2 wives who had come before her, of the chilling silence that surrounded their disappearance. Mama Rose listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When Amelia had finished, the old woman let out a long, slow sigh. "Some things, child," she said, "are best left buried." But Amelia persisted, her voice laced with a desperation that seemed to resonate with the old woman. She spoke not as a mistress to a slave, but as one woman to another, a woman trapped in a gilded cage, terrified of the man who held the key. Finally, Mama Rose relented. She led Amelia into her small one-room cabin. The air inside was cool and dark, the only light coming from the single, small window. On a rough-hewn table, a collection of herbs and roots were laid out to dry. Mama Rose was a healer, a woman who knew the secrets of the earth. She told Amelia of Eleanor, the first wife, a kind and gentle woman who had tried to bring a small measure of compassion to Blackwood Manor. She had taught some of the enslaved children to read, a transgression for which Silas had never forgiven her. When she failed to produce an heir after 2 years of marriage, Silas's disappointment had curdled into a cold, calculating rage. One night, Mama Rose said, Eleanor had simply vanished. The official story was that she had gone to visit family in the north. But the enslaved people knew the truth. They had seen Silas leading her towards the woods, towards the hidden cabin he called his nursery. The second wife, a fiery, defiant woman named Isabel, had met a similar fate. She had openly challenged Silas, questioning his authority, his cruelty. She, too, had failed to conceive, and she, too, had disappeared without a trace. Mama Rose then spoke of the nursery, her voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. It was not a place for children, she said, but a place of unspeakable horror. It was a place where Silas Blackwood, in his obsessive quest for a male heir, had begun to experiment with the very nature of life itself. He was not just a plantation owner, he was a breeder, a man who saw no difference between the people he enslaved and the livestock in his fields. He had started with the enslaved women, forcing them into unions with men he deemed prime stock, hoping to create a new generation of stronger, more resilient workers. But his obsession had grown, twisted into something far more monstrous. He had begun to believe that the key to a strong lineage lay not in the Blackwood name, but in the blood of the women who carried it. The nursery was his laboratory, a place where he could control every aspect of conception and birth, a place where he could create his perfect heir. And any woman who failed to meet his exacting standards, any woman who failed to produce the son he so desperately craved, was deemed a failure. And at Blackwood Manor, failures were not tolerated. They were discarded. As Mama Rose spoke, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The missing wives, the forbidden cabin, Silas's obsessive desire for a son. It was all part of a monstrous plan, a plan that had claimed the lives of at least 2 women and countless others whose names had been lost to history. Amelia left the quarters that day, a changed woman. The naive young bride who had arrived at Blackwood Manor just a few weeks earlier was gone, replaced by a woman who had looked into the abyss and seen the true face of the man she had married. She was no longer just a wife, she was a potential victim, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that she would have to fight for her survival. The whispers of the quarters had become a clarion call, a warning that she could no longer afford to ignore. Chapter 3. The Gilded Cage. The days following her visit to the slave quarters were a torment for Amelia. The grand house, once a symbol of her elevated status, now felt like a prison, its opulent rooms and gilded furnishings a mocking reminder of her gilded cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that danced on the walls, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She saw the truth now, the ugly, festering reality that lay beneath the veneer of Southern gentility. Silas, oblivious to the storm raging within her, continued his daily routines with a chilling, almost theatrical precision. He would rise at dawn, ride out to the fields to oversee the day's work, and return in the evening, his boots caked with the red Alabama clay, his face flushed with the satisfaction of a man who was master of his own universe. He had become more attentive to her, his apathetic demeanor replaced by a cloying, almost suffocating concern for her well-being. He would bring her small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, a new book of poetry, his gestures a grotesque parody of a loving husband. He would inquire about her health, his questions laced with an undercurrent of impatience. "Are you feeling well, my dear?" he would ask, his eyes scanning her for any sign of the delicate condition he so desperately desired. Amelia, for her part, played the role of the dutiful wife, her fear a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. She would smile and nod and thank him for his gifts, her mind racing with plans of escape. But where could she go? Her father, the man who had sold her into this nightmare, would surely send her back. And in 1861 Alabama, a woman, especially a married woman, had no legal standing, no voice of her own. She was, in the eyes of the law, the property of her husband. Her only solace was her secret correspondence with her sister Clara, who lived in Boston. She wrote to her in coded language, her letters filled with veiled references to her unhappiness and her longing for home. She dared not reveal the full extent of the horror she had uncovered, for fear that her letters would be intercepted. One evening, as she was writing to Clara in the soft glow of an oil lamp, Silas entered the room unannounced. He moved with a surprising stealth for a man of his size, his presence a sudden chilling intrusion. He stood behind her, his breath warm on her neck, and read the words on the page. "Unhappiness?" he said, his voice deceptively soft. "What cause have you for unhappiness, my dear? You have a fine home, beautiful clothes, a husband who provides for your every need. What more could a woman want?" Amelia's blood ran cold. She tried to explain, to stammer out some excuse about homesickness, but he cut her off, his hand closing around her wrist, his grip like a steel trap. "You are my wife, Amelia," he said, his voice now a low, menacing growl. "Your happiness is not your own to command. It is my gift to you, and I expect you to be grateful." He tore the letter from her hand and threw it into the fireplace, the flames consuming her desperate plea for help. "There will be no more letters," he said, his eyes burning with a cold, possessive fire. "Your home is here, your life is here, and you will not leave it. Not now, not ever." From that day on, Amelia was a prisoner in her own home. The house servants, who had once offered her a small measure of comfort, now averted their gazes, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and fear. They knew, as she now knew, that she was walking the same path as the women who had come before her. Hattie, the head housekeeper, who had once been so cold and distant, now seemed to soften towards her. One afternoon, as Amelia sat listlessly in the parlor, Hattie brought her a cup of tea. "You must be strong, child," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "He is a man who feeds on weakness." Hattie then told her of a secret, a small, hidden hope in the oppressive darkness of Blackwood Manor. There was a network, she said, a quiet, underground railroad of enslaved people who helped one another, who offered a small measure of comfort and resistance in a world that sought to crush their spirits. They had ways of communicating, of passing messages, of knowing things that the master, in his arrogance, believed were hidden from them. It was a small, flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness. But for Amelia, it was enough. She was not alone. There were others who saw Silas for the monster he was, others who were willing to fight back. The gilded cage had become a battleground, and Amelia, no longer the naive young bride, was ready to fight for her life. The whispers of the quarters had become a promise of a future that she was determined to claim for herself. Chapter 4. The Seeds of Rebellion. The oppressive summer heat of Alabama had given way to the cooler, crisper air of autumn. The cotton had been picked, the fields now a sea of bare brown stalks. The rhythm of life at Blackwood Manor had slowed, but for Amelia, the sense of dread had only intensified. She was a ticking clock, her worth measured in the monthly cycle of her own body. Each passing month without a sign of pregnancy was another step closer to the fate of her predecessors. Her isolation was complete. Silas had forbidden her from leaving the grounds of the plantation, and her every move was watched by Hattie, whose loyalty, Amelia had come to realize, was a complex and shifting thing. Hattie served the master, but she also saw the suffering he inflicted, and in her own quiet way, she offered Amelia a small measure of support. It was Hattie who brought her news from the outside world, snippets of conversations she had overheard, rumors of a growing conflict between the North and the South. The whispers of war were growing louder, a distant drumbeat that promised to shatter the fragile peace of their world. For Amelia, the war was a terrifying prospect, but it was also a glimmer of hope. In the chaos of conflict, there might be a chance for escape, a chance to break free from the gilded cage of Blackwood Manor. Her secret alliance with the enslaved people of the quarters had grown stronger. She would leave small tokens for them, a piece of bread, a length of ribbon, in a hollowed-out tree at the edge of the woods. In return, she would find small gifts of her own, a strangely shaped root that was said to ward off evil, a small hand-carved bird that fit perfectly in the palm of her hand. It was Mama Rose who became her guide, her mentor in the art of survival. The old woman taught her about the healing properties of plants, about the secret language of the birds, about the quiet, unshakable strength that could be found in community. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows across the fields, Amelia met Mama Rose at their secret meeting place. The old woman's face was etched with a new sense of urgency. "The master," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "He is growing impatient. He speaks of bringing in a new breeder, a man from another plantation, a man known for his potency." The words sent a chill through Amelia's bones. Silas's obsession had reached a new, more horrifying level. He was no longer content to wait for nature to take its course. He was going to take matters into his own hands. "What can I do?" Amelia asked, her voice trembling. "You must be clever, child," Mama Rose said, her eyes burning with an intensity that belied her age. "You must use his own weapons against him." And so, the seeds of rebellion were sown. Amelia, with the help of Mama Rose and the other enslaved people of the quarters, began to play a dangerous game. She started to feign the symptoms of pregnancy, a subtle, carefully orchestrated performance designed to buy her time. She would complain of morning sickness, of strange cravings, of a growing weariness. Hattie, who was in on the ruse, would corroborate her stories, her face a mask of concern. Silas, at first, was ecstatic. He became even more attentive, his cloying concern now laced with a triumphant, possessive pride. He had finally succeeded where others had failed. He was going to have his heir. But as the months wore on and Amelia's belly remained stubbornly flat, his suspicion began to grow. He would watch her with a new, more calculating gaze, his eyes searching for any sign of deception. The game was becoming more dangerous with each passing day. The whispers of war were now a roar. The first shots fired at Fort Sumter a deafening declaration of the conflict to come. The men of the county were riding off to join the Confederate Army, their hearts filled with the misguided sense of patriotism and honor. Silas, however, remained at Blackwood Manor. He was too important, he claimed, his cotton too vital to the war effort. But Amelia knew the real reason. He would not leave until he had secured his heir. The tension in the house was a palpable thing, a thick, suffocating blanket of fear and suspicion. Amelia knew that her time was running out. She had to escape, and she had to do it soon. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, but she feared that they would not have time to blossom before Silas's patience and his mercy ran out. The coming war, she prayed, would be her salvation, the chaos her only hope of escape. Chapter 5. The Unholy Alliance. The charade of Amelia's pregnancy could not last forever. As the weeks turned into months, and her body refused to betray the lie, Silas's initial elation curdled into a familiar, cold suspicion. The grand house, which had briefly been filled with a sense of triumphant anticipation, once again fell silent, the air thick with an unspoken menacing tension. Silas's attentiveness took on a new, more sinister edge. He no longer brought her gifts of poetry and ribbons. Instead, he would watch her, his stormy eyes filled with a chilling, calculating intensity. He would question her about her health, his voice laced with a sarcasm that was more terrifying than his anger. Amelia knew that her time was running out. The seeds of rebellion, so carefully sown, were in danger of withering on the vine. She had to find a new way to fight back, a new weapon in her desperate struggle for survival. Her answer came in the form of an unexpected visitor, a man whose presence at Blackwood Manor was as jarring as a clap of thunder on a clear day. His name was Elias Thorne, and he was Silas's younger brother, a man who had been cast out of the family years ago for his radical views and his unseemly behavior. Elias was everything Silas was not. He was wiry and restless, with a quick, sardonic wit and eyes that sparkled with a rebellious fire. He was a gambler, a drinker, and a womanizer, a man who had squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. And he hated his brother with a passion that was almost biblical in its intensity. He had come to Blackwood Manor, he claimed, to offer his services to the Confederate cause, but Amelia suspected his motives were far more complex. He had come to gloat, to witness the slow, agonizing downfall of the brother who had always looked down on him. Silas, for his part, tolerated Elias's presence with a barely concealed contempt. He saw his brother as a necessary evil, a man whose connections in the murky underworld of New Orleans could be useful in the uncertain times to come. Amelia, at first, was wary of Elias. He was a man who lived by his own set of rules, a man who seemed to take a perverse pleasure in the suffering of others. But she also saw in him a potential ally, a man whose hatred for Silas could be turned to her advantage. She began to subtly, carefully, cultivate a relationship with him. She would engage him in conversation, her words a delicate dance of flattery and veiled hints of her own unhappiness. She spoke of her loneliness, of her fear of the coming war, of her longing for a life beyond the suffocating confines of Blackwood Manor. Elias, who had a keen eye for the subtleties of human desperation, quickly saw through her facade. He saw the fear in her eyes, the desperation in her voice, and he saw an opportunity. One evening, as the two of them sat alone in the library, the air thick with the smell of old leather and bourbon, Elias made his move. "He will kill you, you know," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper, "just like he killed the others." Amelia's blood ran cold. She had never spoken of the other wives, had never even hinted at her knowledge of their fate. Elias, it seemed, knew more about the dark secrets of Blackwood Manor than she had ever imagined. He told her of his own suspicions, of the hushed whispers he had heard over the years, of the chilling, almost clinical way his brother had spoken of his desire for an heir. "He is a monster, Amelia," Elias said, his voice filled with a venom that was almost as terrifying as Silas's own. "And he will not stop until he gets what he wants." And so an unholy alliance was formed. Amelia, the trapped and terrified wife, and Elias, the prodigal, resentful brother, united by their shared hatred for the man who held them both in his thrall. Their plan was simple, yet audacious. They would use Silas's own obsession against him. They would find a way to give him the heir he so desperately craved, but on their own terms. They would find a woman, a young, healthy, enslaved woman, and they would pass her child off as Amelia's own. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble, a plan fraught with peril. But for Amelia, it was the only way out. She had to become as cunning, as ruthless, as the man she was trying to escape. She had to make a deal with the devil, and pray that she would not lose her own soul in the process. The seeds of rebellion, she realized, had taken root in the most unexpected of places, in the dark, twisted heart of the Blackwood family itself. Chapter 6. The Chosen One. The search for a woman to carry Silas Blackwood's heir was a grim and desperate business. It was a task that fell to Elias, his connections in the shadowy world of slave traders and back-alley deals making him uniquely suited for the role. He would disappear for days at a time, returning to Blackwood Manor with a new collection of rumors and whispers, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. Amelia, meanwhile, was left to play her part in the charade. She had to feign a renewed sense of hope, a fragile, carefully constructed optimism that she hoped would lull Silas into a false sense of security. She would speak of the future, of the son they would raise together. Her words a bitter, hollow echo of the dreams she had once cherished. Silas, for his part, seemed to be taken in by her performance. His suspicion had been replaced by a cautious, almost paternal concern. He treated her with a new, almost unsettling gentleness, his touch a chilling reminder of the monster that lurked beneath the surface. The choice of a woman was a delicate and dangerous matter. She had to be young, healthy, and most importantly, she had to be someone who could be trusted to keep their secret. It was a task that fell to Mama Rose, her deep, intuitive knowledge of the people of the quarters making her the only one who could be trusted with such a sensitive mission. After weeks of careful observation and quiet, whispered conversations, Mama Rose finally came to Amelia with a name. Her name was Sarah, and she was a young woman who had been at Blackwood Manor for only a few months, having been bought at an auction in Mobile. Sarah was beautiful, with skin the color of polished mahogany, and eyes that held a quiet, defiant strength. She was a survivor, a woman who had endured the horrors of the slave trade with her spirit unbroken. She was also pregnant, a fact that had been carefully concealed from the master. The father of her child was a young man named Samuel, a field hand who had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi just a few weeks after Sarah's arrival at Blackwood Manor. They had been in love, Mama Rose explained. Their brief, stolen moments of happiness, a small act of defiance in a world that sought to deny them their humanity. Sarah, at first, was hesitant to give up her child, to allow it to be raised by the man who had torn her from the arms of the man she loved, was an unthinkable sacrifice. But Mama Rose, with her gentle, persuasive wisdom, helped her to see that it was the only way. "This child," she said, her voice a low, soothing whisper, "will be a symbol of our survival. It will be a seed of hope planted in the heart of our enemy." And so, a new, more dangerous alliance was formed. Amelia, the white mistress of the house, and Sarah, the enslaved woman who carried the future in her womb, united by a shared desire for freedom. The plan was set in motion. Sarah was moved into a small, secluded cabin at the edge of the woods, away from the prying eyes of the other enslaved people. Hattie, who had become an indispensable part of their conspiracy, would bring her food and water, her stern, unreadable expression a mask for the fear and hope that warred within her. Amelia, meanwhile, began to feign the more pronounced symptoms of pregnancy. She would wear layers of clothing to create the illusion of a growing belly, her movements becoming more slow and deliberate. The deception was a constant, nerve-wracking strain. The fear of discovery was a constant, gnawing presence, a shadow that lurked in every corner of the grand house. But it was a fear that was tempered by a new, more powerful emotion, a sense of hope. For the first time since her arrival at Blackwood Manor, Amelia felt a sense of agency, a sense of control over her own destiny. She was no longer just a victim, she was a conspirator, a rebel, a woman who was fighting for her life and the lives of those who had been caught in the crossfire of Silas Blackwood's monstrous ambition. The seeds of rebellion, so carefully sown, had finally begun to sprout, their fragile green shoots pushing their way through the dark, unforgiving soil of Blackwood Manor. Chapter 7. A Tangled Web. The long, hot summer of 1861 dragged on, the air thick with the stench of war and the suffocating tension of a secret that was becoming increasingly difficult to keep. The news from the front lines was a confusing jumble of victories and defeats, the initial optimism of the Confederacy giving way to the grim reality of a long and bloody conflict. At Blackwood Manor, the war was a distant, almost abstract thing. The real battle was being fought in the quiet, shadowed corners of the grand house, a silent, desperate struggle for survival. Amelia's feigned pregnancy was now in its final stages. Her padded belly was a constant, uncomfortable reminder of the lie she was living. She had become a master of deception, her performance so convincing that even Silas, in his arrogance, seemed to have been taken in. But the strain of the charade was beginning to take its toll. She was plagued by nightmares, her sleep filled with images of Eleanor and Isabel, their faces twisted in silent screams. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest, the fear of discovery a suffocating weight on her soul. Elias, her co-conspirator, was a constant, unsettling presence. He seemed to revel in the danger, his eyes gleaming with a reckless, almost gleeful excitement. He would taunt Silas with veiled, sarcastic remarks, his words a dangerous, high-stakes game of cat and mouse. Amelia, at times, found herself more afraid of Elias than she was of Silas. He was a man who seemed to have no moral compass, a man who was capable of anything. She had made a deal with the devil, and she was beginning to fear that the price of her freedom would be her own damnation. The web of their conspiracy was becoming more tangled with each passing day. Hattie, the stoic, silent housekeeper, was their rock, her unwavering loyalty a small, steady light in the overwhelming darkness. But even Hattie, with her nerves of steel, was beginning to show the strain. Her hands would tremble as she served their meals, her eyes darting nervously around the room, as if she expected to see the ghost of Silas's first wife standing in the corner. And then there was Sarah, the young pregnant woman who was the linchpin of their entire plan. She was a constant source of both hope and anxiety for Amelia. She would visit her in her secluded cabin, the two of them united by a strange, unspoken bond. They were from different worlds, their lives separated by the brutal, unbridgeable chasm of slavery. But they were also two women who were fighting for the same thing, a future for their children. As Sarah's time drew near, the tension in the house became almost unbearable. Silas, in his anticipation of the birth of his heir, became even more possessive, his cloying attentiveness a constant, suffocating presence. He would not let Amelia out of his sight, his watchful gaze a constant reminder of the danger they were in. The day of Sarah's labor was a blur of controlled panic and whispered, urgent instructions. Mama Rose, with her calm, steady presence, was their guide, her ancient wisdom a source of comfort in the chaos. The plan was for Sarah to give birth in her cabin, with Mama Rose as her midwife. Hattie would then smuggle the baby into the great house, where Amelia would be waiting, her own feigned labor having reached its dramatic, theatrical climax. It was a plan that was fraught with peril, a plan that could fall apart at any moment. The slightest misstep, the slightest hint of suspicion, could mean death for them all. The tangled web they had woven was about to be put to the ultimate test, and as the first, faint cries of a newborn baby echoed through the still night air, Amelia knew that their lives and the future of Blackwood Manor would be changed forever. Chapter 8. The Cry in the Night. The cry when it came was a thin, reedy wail, a sound that cut through the oppressive silence of the Alabama night. It was the sound of a new life, a new hope, a new and terrible complication in the tangled web of their conspiracy. In the secluded cabin at the edge of the woods, Sarah, exhausted but triumphant, held her newborn son in her arms. He was a beautiful, healthy baby, with a shock of black hair and his mother's defiant, intelligent eyes. He was the future, the seed of a new generation, a symbol of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of places. In the great house, in the grand, four-poster bed that had been the scene of so much sorrow, Amelia's own performance had reached its crescendo. Her feigned cries of pain echoed through the halls, a dramatic, theatrical counterpoint to the real, raw miracle that had taken place just a few hundred yards away. Silas, in his frantic, almost comical anticipation, paced the floor outside her bedroom, his heavy footsteps a steady rhythmic drumbeat of impatience. He had summoned the local doctor, a bumbling, self-important man who was more interested in the quality of Silas's bourbon than in the well-being of his wife. The plan was in motion, a complex, high-stakes ballet of deception and misdirection. Hattie, her face a mask of stoic calm, was the choreographer, her movements precise and economical. She had drugged the doctor's drink, a sleeping potion concocted by Mama Rose that would ensure he was in no condition to question the miraculous speed of the birth. As the doctor snored in a nearby armchair, his snores a comical counterpoint to the drama unfolding around him, Hattie slipped out of the house and made her way to the cabin. The moon was a thin, silver sliver in the sky, the air cool and still. The exchange was a swift, silent, heartbreaking transaction. Sarah, her eyes filled with tears, kissed her baby one last time and handed him to Hattie. It was an act of unimaginable sacrifice, a mother's love, a powerful, desperate force in a world that sought to deny her her own humanity. Hattie, her own heart aching with the sorrow she dared not show, wrapped the baby in a warm blanket and carried him back to the great house. She moved like a shadow, her footsteps silent on the soft, damp earth. Amelia was waiting, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment Hattie placed the baby in her arms, a wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked her off her feet washed over her. He was so small, so perfect, so utterly, terrifyingly real. The lie she had been living for so long had suddenly become a tangible, breathing thing. This was no longer a game, a charade. This was a human life, a life that was now in her hands. When Silas finally burst into the room, his face flushed with a mixture of anxiety and triumph, he found his wife, pale and exhausted, with his newborn son cradled in her arms. He looked at the baby, his stormy eyes softening with a sentiment that was almost, but not quite, love. It was a look of possessive pride, of a man who had finally achieved his ultimate goal. He had his heir. The Blackwood name would live on. He reached out to touch the baby, his hand, which had inflicted so much pain, now surprisingly gentle. "He is perfect," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, almost reverent awe. "He is a Blackwood." Amelia, her own emotions a tangled, confusing mess of relief, guilt, and a strange, unexpected surge of maternal love, could only nod. The first, most dangerous part of their plan had succeeded. They had given the monster his prize. But as she looked at the innocent, sleeping face of the child in her arms, a new, more terrifying question began to form in her mind. What would happen when the monster realized he had been deceived? The cry in the night had been a sound of triumph, but it was also a warning, a prelude to a storm that was far from over. Chapter 9. A Fragile Peace. The arrival of the baby, who Silas had named Sterling, after his own father, brought a strange, fragile peace to Blackwood Manor. The grand house, which had for so long been a place of fear and suspicion, was now filled with the sounds of a new life, the soft gurgles of a contented infant, the gentle creak of a rocking cradle, the hushed, cooing whispers of a woman who was playing the role of a loving mother. Amelia, to her own surprise, had taken to the role with a natural, almost effortless grace. The lie she was living had become a strange, twisted kind of truth. The baby, who was not her own, had somehow managed to capture her heart. She would spend hours with him, her fingers tracing the delicate curve of his cheek, her heart aching with a love that was as real as it was forbidden. Silas, for his part, was a changed man. The cold, calculating cruelty that had been his defining characteristic had been replaced by a new, almost boyish enthusiasm. He would spend hours in the nursery, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he held his son. He would speak of the future, of the legacy he would build for his heir, his voice filled with a triumphant, almost delusional pride. The fragile peace, however, was a deception, a thin veneer of domestic tranquility that did little to mask the ugly, festering reality that lay beneath. The war was raging, the news from the front lines a constant grim reminder of the violence that was tearing their world apart. And at Blackwood Manor, the battle for survival was far from over. Elias, the architect of their conspiracy, had disappeared, his restless spirit unable to tolerate the suffocating atmosphere of domesticity. He had gone to New Orleans, he had said, to offer his services to the Confederate cause. But Amelia suspected his motives were far more selfish. He had gotten what he wanted, the humiliation of his brother, and he had no interest in sticking around to clean up the mess. His absence was both a relief and a source of anxiety for Amelia. She no longer had to endure his cynical, mocking presence, but she had also lost her most powerful ally. She was on her own, a lone conspirator in a house full of secrets. Her only true confidant was Sarah, the baby's real mother. They would meet in secret, their stolen moments together a bittersweet mixture of joy and sorrow. Sarah, her heart breaking with a mother's love, would watch her son from a distance, her eyes filled with a longing that was almost too painful to bear. Amelia, her own heart aching with a guilt she could not escape, would try to offer her some small measure of comfort. She would tell her of the baby's progress, of his first smile, of the way he gripped her finger with his tiny hand. It was a strange, twisted kind of family they had created, a family born of desperation and deceit. They were all living a lie, their lives a tangled web of secrets and unspoken truths. The fragile peace was shattered one evening when Silas, in a rare moment of introspection, spoke of his first wife, Eleanor. He had been drinking, his usual stoic reserve loosened by the effects of the bourbon. "She was a good woman," he said, his voice thick with a strange, almost mournful nostalgia. "But she was weak. She did not understand the importance of a legacy, of a name. She did not understand what it takes to build an empire." He looked at Amelia, his stormy eyes filled with a new, more chilling intensity. "You are different, my dear," he said, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "You are a survivor. You understand what it takes to win." The words sent a shiver down Amelia's spine. She had thought that the birth of his son had softened him, had made him more human, but she was wrong. The monster was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. The fragile peace was an illusion, a temporary reprieve from a storm that was gathering on the horizon, and Amelia knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she was standing in the eye of the hurricane. Chapter 10. The Serpent's Return. The serpent, in the form of Elias Thorne, returned to Blackwood Manor in the spring of 1862. He arrived unannounced, his clothes caked with the dust of the road, his eyes gleaming with a new, more dangerous kind of hunger. He had been in New Orleans, he said, and the city, with its intoxicating mix of decadence and despair, had sharpened his appetite for chaos. His return shattered the fragile peace that had settled over the plantation. He brought with him the stench of the outside world, a world that was being torn apart by a war that was growing more brutal with each passing day. He seemed to take a perverse pleasure in tormenting Silas, his words a constant subtle barrage of innuendo and veiled threats. He would praise Amelia's miraculous recovery from childbirth, his eyes twinkling with a malicious, knowing glee. He would coo over the baby, his compliments laced with a sarcasm that was as sharp as a razor blade. Silas, for his part, tolerated his brother's presence with a barely concealed, simmering rage. He needed Elias, his connections in the murky underworld of the war-torn South more valuable than ever. The cotton trade, the source of his wealth, had been crippled by the Union blockade, and he was being forced to find new, more illicit, ways to maintain his empire. Amelia, caught in the crossfire of their fraternal hatred, felt a new, more terrifying kind of fear. Elias, her former ally, had become her tormentor. He seemed to know her secret, to see the guilt and fear that gnawed at her soul. He would watch her, his gaze a constant, unsettling reminder of the lie she was living. One evening, as she sat alone in the garden, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and impending rain, Elias joined her. He sat down beside her, his presence a sudden, unwelcome intrusion. "He is a fine-looking boy," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "He has his mother's eyes." Amelia's blood ran cold. She tried to feign ignorance, to pretend she didn't know what he was talking about. But Elias was not a man to be trifled with. "Don't play the fool with me, Amelia," he said, his voice now a low, menacing growl. "I know what you did. I know everything." He then laid out his demands. He wanted money, a share of the Blackwood fortune, a reward for his silence. If she refused, he would tell Silas everything. He would watch, with a gleeful, sadistic pleasure, as his brother's world came crashing down around him. Amelia was trapped. She had made a deal with the devil, and now he had come to collect his due. She had no choice but to agree to his demands. She began to steal from Silas, small amounts of money at first, then larger and larger sums, her hands trembling as she opened his safe, her heart pounding with the fear of discovery. The theft, however, was more than just a financial transaction. It was a violation, a betrayal, a further descent into the moral abyss into which she had been cast. She had become a thief, a liar, a conspirator in her own damnation. The serpent had returned to the garden, and he had brought with him a new, more insidious kind of poison. The fragile peace had been shattered, replaced by a new, more terrifying kind of war. A war of whispers and blackmail, a war that was being fought in the shadowed, secret corners of her own soul. And Amelia, with a growing sense of dread, was beginning to realize that it was a war she was in danger of losing. Chapter 11. The Cracks in the Facade. The summer of 1862 was a season of discontent at Blackwood Manor. The war was not going well for the Confederacy, the initial optimism of a quick victory now a distant, mocking memory. The Union Army was pushing deeper into the South, their presence a constant growing threat. The cracks in the facade of Blackwood Manor were beginning to show. Silas, his fortune dwindling, his empire crumbling, had become a man consumed by a new, more desperate kind of paranoia. He would spend his days locked in his study, his face a mask of grim, obsessive concentration. He would pore over his account books, his brow furrowed with a frustration that was slowly, inexorably, turning to rage. The money that Elias was extorting from Amelia was becoming more difficult to obtain. Silas, in his paranoia, had begun to suspect that he was being cheated, that there was a traitor in his midst. He would watch his wife, his brother, even his most trusted servants, with a new, more suspicious gaze. The grand house, once a symbol of his power and wealth, had become a pressure cooker, the air thick with the suffocating tension of a secret that was on the verge of being exposed. Amelia, caught in the middle of it all, was on the verge of a breakdown. The strain of her deception, the constant fear of discovery, the guilt that gnawed at her soul, had taken their toll. She had become a shadow of her former self, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a hunted, haunted look. Her only solace was the child, Sterling, who was growing into a happy, healthy toddler. He was a beacon of light in the overwhelming darkness, a reminder of the life she was fighting to protect. But even he was not immune to the poison that was seeping into the foundations of Blackwood Manor. He was a Blackwood, and he was beginning to show signs of his father's temper, his possessive, demanding nature. He would throw tantrums when he didn't get his way, his small face contorted with a rage that was a chilling echo of his father's own. Amelia, with a growing sense of dread, saw the seeds of the Blackwood curse taking root in the innocent soul of the child she had come to love as her own. She had saved him from one kind of slavery, only to condemn him to another. The cracks in the facade were most apparent in the relationship between Silas and Elias. Their fraternal hatred had escalated into a full-blown war, their verbal sparring now laced with a new, more violent edge. They would argue for hours, their voices echoing through the halls of the grand house, their words a torrent of accusation and recrimination. One evening, their argument reached a new, more dangerous level. Silas, his face contorted with a drunken rage, accused Elias of stealing from him, of betraying him, of trying to destroy him. Elias, his own face a mask of cold, contemptuous fury, denied everything. But his denial was laced with a sarcasm that was designed to provoke, to push his brother to the brink. The argument ended with a crash, the sound of a bottle being thrown against the wall, the tinkle of shattering glass, a stark, violent punctuation to their bitter, hate-filled words. Amelia, who had been listening from the top of the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest, knew that they had reached a point of no return. The facade had crumbled, the ugly, festering reality of their family now exposed for all to see. The war had come to Blackwood Manor, and it was a war that would be fought not on the battlefields of Virginia, but in the dark, twisted, hate-filled hearts of the Blackwood brothers. And Amelia, with a terrifying certainty, knew that she and the child she had sworn to protect were standing in the line of fire. Chapter 12. The Unraveling. The unraveling began with a whisper, a stray comment overheard by a house servant, a piece of gossip passed from one person to another, a single loose thread that, once pulled, would cause the entire tapestry of their deception to come undone. The whisper was about Sarah, the young enslaved woman who was the mother of Silas Blackwood's heir. She had been seen in the woods, near the secluded cabin where she had given birth, her face etched with a sorrow that was too profound to be ignored. The whisper reached the ears of Hattie, the stoic, silent housekeeper who, in her own quiet way, had been a guardian of their secret. She tried to dismiss it as idle gossip, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The whisper then reached the ears of Silas, a man who was already consumed by a paranoid, all-consuming suspicion. He had noticed the way Hattie would avert her gaze when he spoke of his son, the way Amelia would flinch when he touched her. He had noticed the small, almost imperceptible cracks in their carefully constructed facade. He began to watch them, his stormy eyes filled with a new, more calculating intensity. He was a hunter, and he had caught the scent of his prey. The unraveling continued with a discovery, a small hand-carved bird that Amelia had given to Sarah as a gift, a symbol of their strange, unspoken bond. Silas found it in his wife's jewelry box, a place where it had no right to be. He recognized the carving, the distinctive style of a man named Samuel, a field hand who had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi, a man who, he now realized, had been Sarah's lover. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The feigned pregnancy, the miraculous birth, the uncanny resemblance between his son and the young enslaved woman who had so mysteriously disappeared from the quarters. It was all a lie, a monstrous, elaborate deception. The final devastating blow came from Elias, the serpent in their garden, the man who had been the architect of their downfall. He had been watching, waiting, for the right moment to strike. He had seen the way the wind was blowing, and he knew that it was time to save his own skin. He went to Silas, his face a mask of feigned remorse, and he told him everything. He painted himself as a reluctant accomplice, a man who had been manipulated by a cunning, deceitful woman. He laid the blame squarely at Amelia's feet, his words a torrent of poison and betrayal. The unraveling was complete. The tapestry of their deception had been torn to shreds, the ugly, festering reality of their lives now exposed for all to see. Silas's rage was a terrible biblical thing. It was not the hot, explosive anger of a man who had been betrayed. It was a cold, calculating, methodical fury, the rage of a man whose entire world had been built on a foundation of lies. He did not confront Amelia immediately. He waited, his silence more terrifying than any words. He watched her, his stormy eyes filled with a chilling, almost clinical detachment. He was a man who was planning a murder, and he was taking his time, savoring the anticipation of his revenge. The unraveling had been swift and brutal and complete, and as the storm of Silas's fury gathered on the horizon, Amelia knew that there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The reckoning had come. Chapter 13. The Reckoning. The reckoning came not with a bang, but with a chilling, almost theatrical, calm. Silas summoned Amelia to the library, the room where their unholy alliance had been formed, the room that would now be the scene of her damnation. He was sitting behind his large mahogany desk, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. The air in the room was thick with the smell of old leather and impending violence. He did not speak at first. He simply watched her, his stormy eyes filled with a look of such profound, bottomless hatred that it made her blood run cold. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, menacing whisper, a voice that was more terrifying than any shout. "You have made a fool of me, Amelia," he said, his words as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "You have defiled my name, my home, my legacy." He then laid out the evidence of her betrayal: the hand-carved bird, the whispers of the servants, the confession of his brother. He spoke with a chilling, almost clinical detachment, his words a slow, methodical dissection of her lies. Amelia, her own voice a choked, barely audible whisper, tried to explain, to plead for mercy, but her words were lost in the storm of his rage. He rose from his chair, his large frame seeming to fill the entire room. He moved towards her, his footsteps slow and deliberate, the sound of a predator closing in on its prey. "You have taken from me the one thing I valued most," he said, his voice now a low, menacing growl. "You have taken from me my son." He then told her of her punishment. She would not be killed. That would be too easy, too merciful. She would be made to suffer, to pay for her betrayal in a way that was far more cruel, far more imaginative than a simple, clean death. She would be sent to the nursery, the hidden secret place where his other failures had been sent. She would become one of them, a breeder, a vessel for the creation of a new, more pure line of Blackwood heirs. The horror of his words was so profound, so absolute, that it almost stopped her heart. She had thought she had known the depths of his depravity, but she had been wrong. He was a monster, a man whose capacity for cruelty was as boundless as his ambition. The reckoning had come, and it was more terrible than anything she could have ever imagined. She was no longer Amelia Blackwood, the mistress of the manor. She was a piece of property, a commodity, a thing to be used and discarded at the whim of her master. She had tried to fight the monster, and she had lost. And now she was about to be consumed by the darkness. Chapter 14. The Nursery. The nursery was a place of shadows and whispers, a hidden, secret world where the sun never seemed to shine. It was a collection of small, windowless cabins tucked away in a deep, secluded hollow at the edge of the woods. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and despair. This was Silas Blackwood's laboratory, his breeding ground, the place where his monstrous obsession had been allowed to fester and grow. It was a place where women were not women, but vessels, their bodies a means to an end, their lives a footnote in the grand, twisted narrative of the Blackwood legacy. Amelia was taken there in the dead of night, her arms bound, her mouth gagged, her heart a cold, dead weight in her chest. She was thrown into one of the cabins, the door bolted behind her, the sound of the lock clicking into place a final, definitive end to the life she had once known. The cabin was dark and cold, the only light coming from a single flickering candle. In the dim, wavering light, she could see the faces of the other women, their eyes hollow and empty, their spirits broken. They were the ghosts of Blackwood Manor, the women who had been deemed failures, the women who had been discarded. There was Eleanor, the first wife, her once beautiful face now a mask of gaunt, haunted despair. There was Isabel, the fiery, defiant second wife, her spirit now a smoldering, dying ember. And there were others, enslaved women whose names had been lost to history, their only identity now the number that had been branded on their arms. They were all here, trapped in this living hell, their only purpose to produce the perfect heir for a man who had stripped them of their humanity. The days in the nursery were a monotonous, soul-crushing cycle of despair. They were fed just enough to keep them alive, their meals a tasteless, watery gruel. They were allowed out of their cabins for 1 hour each day, a brief, supervised walk in a small, fenced-in yard. And then there were the nights when Silas would come to them, his face a mask of cold, clinical detachment. He was a scientist, and they were his experiments. He would choose one of them, his stormy eyes filled with a chilling, impersonal lust, and he would take her, his act of violation a cold, calculated transaction. Amelia, at first, fought back. She would scream and scratch and kick, her defiance a small, futile act of rebellion in a world that sought to crush her spirit. But her resistance was met with a brutal, systematic violence that left her body bruised and her soul shattered. She learned, as the others had learned, that survival in the nursery depended on a kind of death. A death of the spirit, a surrender of the will. She became a ghost, a hollow, empty shell of her former self. But even in the depths of her despair, a small, flickering ember of hope remained. It was the memory of the child, Sterling, the child she had come to love as her own. She would close her eyes and picture his face, his smile, the way he had gripped her finger with his tiny hand. The memory was a lifeline, a reason to keep breathing, a reason to endure the unendurable. She had to survive. She had to find a way to escape. She had to get back to the child she had sworn to protect. The nursery was a place of death, but Amelia Blackwood was not ready to die. The seeds of rebellion, so brutally crushed, had begun to stir once more, a small, defiant flicker of life in the overwhelming darkness. Chapter 15. The Fire of Freedom. The fire started in the dead of night, a small, flickering flame that quickly grew into a raging, all-consuming inferno. It was a fire of rebellion, a fire of retribution, a fire that would cleanse Blackwood Manor of the evil that had taken root in its heart. The architect of the fire was a woman who had nothing left to lose, a woman whose spirit had been forged in the crucible of unimaginable suffering. Her name was Sarah, and she was the mother of the child who had been the catalyst for so much pain. She had watched from a distance as Amelia had been dragged to the nursery, her heart breaking with a sorrow and a rage that was too profound for tears. She had seen the way the other enslaved people of the quarters had averted their gazes, their faces a mask of fear and resignation. But Sarah was not a woman who would surrender to despair. She was a survivor, a fighter, a woman who would not be broken. She had found an unlikely ally in Hattie, the stoic, silent housekeeper whose loyalty to the master had finally been shattered by his ultimate act of cruelty. Hattie, who knew the secrets of the great house, the location of the oil lamps, the hidden secret passages that snaked their way through the walls. Together, they had planned their rebellion, their whispers, a secret, defiant language of hope in a world that sought to silence them. The fire was their signal, their declaration of war. As the flames licked at the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the cotton fields, Sarah and Hattie, with the help of a small, trusted group of enslaved men, made their way to the nursery. They overpowered the guards, their movements swift and silent, their hearts filled with a righteous, liberating fury. They broke down the doors of the cabins, their shouts of "Freedom!" a clarion call that echoed through the night. The women of the nursery, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief, stumbled out into the cool night air. They were ghosts, their bodies weak, their spirits broken. But as they saw the flames of the great house, as they heard the shouts of their liberators, a spark of life returned to their eyes. Amelia, her own heart pounding in her chest, found herself swept up in the chaos. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, a warrior, a woman who was fighting for her life. In the confusion of the fire, as the men of the plantation scrambled to save the great house, a small, desperate group of fugitives made their way to the woods. It was Amelia and Sarah and Hattie and the child, Sterling, who Hattie had snatched from his cradle in the heart of the inferno. They ran through the woods, the sound of the crackling flames and the shouts of their pursuers behind them. They were running towards an uncertain future, a future that was fraught with peril. But they were running towards freedom. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale pink glow over the horizon, they reached the banks of a wide, slow-moving river. A small, rickety boat was waiting for them, a prearranged part of their escape plan. As they pushed off from the shore, the sound of the dogs in the distance a faint, fading echo. Amelia looked back at the smoke that was rising from the ruins of Blackwood Manor. It was a funeral pyre, a monument to the death of an empire, the end of a nightmare. She looked at the child in her arms, his face peaceful in the soft morning light. He was the future, a symbol of a new beginning, a seed of hope that had been planted in the ashes of the old world. She looked at Sarah, her face etched with a quiet, steely determination. And she looked at Hattie, her own face a mask of grim, unwavering resolve. They were a strange, unlikely family, a family forged in the fires of rebellion. They did not know what the future held. They were fugitives, outcasts, women who had dared to defy the brutal, unforgiving world in which they lived. But they were free. And as the small boat made its way down the river, towards the promise of a new day, Amelia knew, with a certainty that was as clear and bright as the morning sun, that they would survive. They had been to hell and back, and they had emerged from the flames, scarred but unbroken, their spirits forged in the fire of freedom.